You're listening to Navigating the French on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content and a bonus episode of Navigating the French, please join us on Patreon.
Hello, and welcome to Navigating the French, the podcast where each episode we take a look at a French word and try and see what it tells us about French culture. I'm your host, Emily Monaco. Today I'm chatting with Megan Brown, a historian of modern Europe with a focus on 20th century France, European integration, and empire at Swarthmore College. She's here to discuss an element of Frenchness that many would say seeks to protect French culture and values, but, as we'll see, actually raises questions about what it truly means to be French, or not, as the case may be. Intégration. Welcome so much, Megan, to the show. Would you be able to tell our listeners a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Definitely. Thanks so much for having me on. I'm excited for this conversation. So I am an associate professor of history at Swarthmore College, which is located outside of Philadelphia. And college, of course, confuses French people. It's not middle school. It's university level, but no graduate students. And my first book came out last year. It's called The Seventh Member State, Algeria, France, and the European Community, and it examines European integration and decolonization, and specifically looking at Algeria's legal status as France joined some other European states to negotiate the precursors to the European Union. And I teach classes on modern Europe, France and Algeria, kind of a variety of things, nationalism in the European context, and more.
Wow. Okay, so that's amazing. And I'm really excited to delve into this topic with you, especially seeing as I think part of the reason I wanted to talk about intégré and intégration is that it's something that I think a lot of expats in Paris talk about. But when I talk about integration with my American friends, and, you know, we are very proud, and obviously we can pull that apart a little bit, but we're very proud in the United States of our diversity and of this sort of patchwork of cultures that make us who we are. In France, there is a lot of emphasis placed on integration. And depending on where you come from originally, that can mean abandoning or avoiding talking about or downplaying some elements of sort of your home culture. And it's something that we talk about a lot when we talk about becoming a French citizen. And so I'm really excited to sort of delve into this topic with you on all fronts.
Definitely.
So before we kind of get into the more specific questions, just on sort of a larger scale, when it comes to questions of immigration and citizenship, because the two are not necessarily always going to be the same thing, do you get the sense that the French value an integrationist mindset for these newcomers to France more than other Western or other European nations?
I can speak best probably to the French and then US context, with maybe the French as my academic knowledge and my US as my personal knowledge. But I can also dive in a bit to think about other European states as well. You know, when we talk about the US, I, as a child of the 80s, remember a lot of discussions about the American melting pot, but I've seen that in recent years that has sort of moved away to other metaphors, like a mixed salad where, you know, everybody's jumbled together but maintains their own, you know, unique elements, their culture, maybe linguistic heritage and pride in that. And in comparison, one of the real classics on the history of French immigration is by Traîné Noiriel, and it's called Le Creuset Français, and it's really meant to be that sort of sense of the melting pot there, really the cooking pot of French public. It looks really different in part because when we talk about immigration in France and also citizenship, sometimes we're not talking about people who have arrived in their own lifetime. Sometimes we're talking about third generation French citizens who are still being understood as outsiders. And I know you've talked about that in some other episodes in ways that are really exciting. So maybe, you know, part of our conversation is going to be building on that. I do think that overall the French state does value integration very explicitly. And in that sense, it matters quite a bit that there is a sense that to be French is to be integrated. And, maybe another word that matters in thinking about intégration or intégré is communautarisme, which I think is very hard to translate into English because that sense that communautarisme has I would say, a real negative blush to it in French, that to be of your community, communitarianism is insidious and potentially a threat to one's own ability to exist in France, operate as a French person alongside other French people, shows the degree to which the French are valuing integration. More broadly, on a European scale, and I'm sure we can talk about this more throughout our conversation, is this sort of really perniciously persistent assumption that Europeanness is whiteness and that any people of color are new. And it's at this point almost a bizarre belief because historically speaking, communities of color have been living in continental Europe for literally centuries. So that newness is in itself a historical fallacy. That sort of assumption is just wrong. But then if we get more realistic, and I really emphasize this both in my writing, but especially in my teaching, that to talk about Europe and assume that it is continentally bound allows for a very pat history of Europe where there's like continental Europe and then suddenly there's immigration from places where there were people of color, ignoring the reality that many of these sites of where immigrants are coming from are former colonies of France, of Britain, or, mandates. We're thinking about other sort of forms of imperialism, but also places that we forget had colonies, like the Netherlands, like Germany, so thinking about reasserting histories of people of color into the history of Europe, I think is a really important thing. To get back to maybe this question of valuing integration, I think it's highly valued to the detriment of historical accuracy and people's actual lived experience in these places.
I mean, mic drop. That is so, it's so convoluted and complex, and you've, boiled it down to a really essential point, which is that, when I think about this question of integration a lot, and I think about it in my own life and speaking from a place of definite privilege when it comes to integration in France, in that I already speak French, I'm white, I come from a Catholic background. Like, there's not a lot of cultural baggage that I'm bringing into that would set me at odds with what the French and maybe Western Europe want to believe their identity is and the identity that we're supposed to integrate towards. But you've hit this really important point, which is that that's not necessarily the truth of what Europe or France in this specific case actually is from a historical standpoint. So when we consider integration and when we're asking, you hear it on an official level, like on a bureaucratic level in terms of integration. And, when you do your citizenship test, they ask, do you belong to any French associations? What percentage of your friends are French speaking? Do you speak French? Do you watch French television? So there's this whole cultural aspect of it. And then there's also these values that I've spoken about on other episodes of the podcast of, the values the French consider to be their values, which are things like laïcité. That's a very big one, freedom, equality, things like that. When you consider what the French are actually expecting of people when they ask them to integrate, whether it's on that official bureaucratic level or just random French people who will occasionally say things like, oh, I wish that this group, usually it's a socioeconomic or a racial or an international group of some kind. I wish they would integrate a little bit more. What are they actually asking for? What do they expect, like a very major scare quote, good immigrant will look like when they integrate?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And, I should also say I am absolutely speaking from a place of privilege as a white person who, in the times that I've lived in Paris, I think there's just an assumption that I'm an expat and that already carries a much more romantic connotation than immigrant, this sort of sense that I can both do what I want because it's so fun, an American expat, but also, right, that there's a sense that I won't be ever challenging a French status quo by my very being in any kind of way. and maybe also an assumption that I will inherently enjoy France and, sort of get it. And that carries with it its own kind of relationship to being a foreigner or being perceived as foreign in France. I do think that the idea of adhering to French values has become the really key point of integration, particularly in terms of political pedantry, but that definitely has sort of bled into intellectual life and more. So, I think things like speaking fluent French, and I have not gone through the citizenship process, so I haven't heard those kinds of demands firsthand, but often that setting people aside because they do or don't speak French can be a challenge, because people coming from France's former colonies, even to this day, are often incredibly multilingual. And so French would be part of it. So it would be hard to fully discriminate against somebody for their linguistic capacity based on that really long educational history. But French values, it's such a mutable term. And so I think, laïcité, for example, is a big one of those French values where I've been struck in recent years that whenever there is some sort of horrific attack that is deemed a terrorist attack and is most typically blamed on Islam writ large or communautarisme, with the sense that is a Muslim communautarisme sort of as the threat to the French Republic, the suggestion in the media and on the part of politicians, I should say of multiple political parties and persuasions, is that there's a failure at an almost primary school level to imbue children with the knowledge that laïcité is this true Republican value, and in fact maybe is the number one Republican value over liberté, égalité, fraternité, that will allow for people to live in harmony as all good French citizens should. And that's really kind of funny to think that laïcité would be up there with égalité when it is most assuredly not part of the slogan of the French Republic. And I think it's useful because it is so much easier to accuse somebody of not living up to values than it is to say that you do or do not speak a good level of French, right? At a certain point, somebody can take a test and somebody can improve their capacity for good grammar or something like that. But there might be limitations, or somebody might easily be able to claim that somebody has limitations on adapting to good French values. Often, I think that there's a racial and a racialized religious component. A lot of historians have written about ways that France, historically, the French state has sort of racialized Islam so that even somebody who is not a practicing Muslim is sort of being associated with or put into a legal regime of being Muslim in ways that can then isolate them from rights and more. But it's not the only value. I'd say that linked to that can be values about gender equality and also respect of the LGBTQ community in ways that completely ignore France's own sexism, France's own, we could say, very, very belated laws about consent, protecting children, and more, but also ignoring France's own very homegrown homophobic movements, particularly, but not just among far-right political parties that now kind of can operate to say that homophobia or sexism is some sort of Muslim trait, and that real French values value women, value the queer community in France and more, which completely ignores the recent past again. So I think that values are really that space for claiming integration, but also claiming that certain groups are unassimilable because they certainly could never actually subscribe to these values.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and it's an interesting element to explore in terms of LGBTQ or queer representation, specifically when we look at the way in which, the left in the United States is pushing for visibility. And I think that in France, something that I discussed on the episode on laïcité with Lindsay Tremuta that I think is apt here is that part of what has been perceived in France as being a quote unquote good Jewish person or a quote unquote good, person of, like you said, sort of this conflation between coming from the Arab world and maybe having Muslim heritage, whether one is or not a practicing Muslim, is that making your religious practice be something that you do at home seems to go hand in hand with this sort of being a good French citizen and this question of equality and these questions of integration. So I wonder in what context, and maybe we're going a little bit off topic with this, but in what context is integration a question of the visibility of what makes you different? And in what context is it about actually adopting that French language, those French values, or even, ostensibly the sort of secular Christian roots that the French seem to cast a blind eye towards when they, for example, set their bank holidays?
Yes. I do think that that question of public life, private life is such a good one. It's obviously, yes, I think that with questions of laïcité, it's the most obvious. For example, the laws about overt religious symbols in schools technically is about any religious practice. You cannot wear an ostentatious crucifix. You cannot wear a yarmulke. You cannot wear a headscarf. But to my knowledge, most Christian practices don't require wearing a crucifix as a part of religious faith. It's more of a decision, right, to show faith than it is a requirement of religious law. And on the whole, although certainly there would be exceptions, Jewish schoolboys who are religious enough to be wearing a yarmulke are typically sent to private Jewish schools by their families. So they are not running into that issue of having to take off a required by religious law / their desire to wear that. They're not required to do that because they're not entering into a public school setting. And so that leaves the much larger Muslim population where those children, or, and also you should say young adults, right, who are choosing to wear a headscarf, that they are the visible sign of a supposed inability to embrace laïcité. In private life, though, the sense is that anything goes, right? And I think a different conversation maybe is the French understanding of private life is very different than an American understanding of private life. That can sometimes even relate, for example, on the one hand, say with the Clinton-Lewinsky affair, on the one hand, Americans were blamed for their Puritan nature, right? In the sense that the US was scandalized by this and the French are shrugging their shoulders. But there's also a sense of being perplexed that somebody's private life does not have bearing on their public expression of themselves, so that even a politician, a public figure, has a private life. And so I think that there is a larger sense in France of what one does privately does not impact the Republic, but anything that is visible could be very, very troubling.
If you're enjoying this podcast, you may enjoy our sister podcast, City of Muses, which is brand new to the Paris Underground Radio Network. Each week, join City of Muses host Jennifer Garrity as she sits down with contemporary artists, poets, dancers, designers, and performers to explore what inspires them, where their ideas come from, and how Paris has helped or hindered their dreams come true. Inspiration and creativity meet in Paris, the City of Muses. Check out City of Muses now, available wherever you listen to podcasts. Navigating the French will be right back after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French.
So if we consider then the fact that this is sort of a long-standing desire within French society, have you, in your research, been able to identify a moment in history when this push for integration became palpable among the French or by the French state, which I know are probably two different moments in time? Or maybe they're conflated, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I don't know that we could say that there's like a moment. So, in thinking about even what intégration means as a definition, it can mean social assimilation, but it can also mean political unification. And I think that they're not unrelated in French history. So, most germane to my own research, the French state administered, at the very least, the northern portions of Algeria as départements. So the same as the metropolitan département were administered, meaning that there was a political administrative unification of Algerian land, though not Algerian peoples, who were by and large still denied French citizenship. Related to that, then, social assimilation can mean fitting into French culture and being potentially considered for citizenship, but showing a social assimilation, speaking French, serving in the French army, prior to decolonization did not necessarily translate into French citizenship, which is all to say that before decolonization, which for France, much of France's decolonization occurred from 1960 to 1962. France still has overseas territories and départements to this day. But prior to that, there was actually an incredible legal pluralism, meaning that assimilation and integration were perhaps really not valued by France. The state actively worked against creating a system of pure integration, with the assumption being that some populations would not be fit for citizenship or were not desirable as citizens, and thus full integration was never going to be the goal. After decolonization, and particularly after Algeria's independence in 1962, I would say that we do start to identify moments where integration becomes a more palpable desire from the French state, and then also, right, as a way to win voters and more by beginning to really raise the specter of the very foreign, very dangerous migrant who, lo and behold, came from an area that in very recent memory had been considered a part of France, right? L'Algérie, c'est la France was a battle cry for groups that were opposing Algerian independence. In the 1970s, Europe really experiences the oil shock very keenly. And this leads France and also West Germany to freeze what had been quite open post-war migration. And so I was recently reading, as I was prepping for a class, that some scholars have pinpointed a 1982 car factory strike in Aulnay-sous-Bois as being a moment when the press started to describe the striking workers as immigrés and not just as workers. So starting to really classify people as immigrés, even as they are, sort of participating in that very French activity of grève. And then in the 80s and 90s, Algerian migration again ramped up and was really in the news because of a very horrific civil war, particularly in the 90s in Algeria. And all of these ways, I would say, created new discourse about new migrants, even though they're part of a much longer pattern of migration and long existing communities in metropolitan France, that then would invite concerns about integration or the desire of these new populations to integrate, fit in, blend in, right? Eventually sort of disappear by virtue of becoming French versus, sort of sticking out or asserting other cultural markers in addition. And I'd also say, Spain and Portugal were and remain important senders of migrants to France. But in the mid-1980s, they both joined the European community and they become, in that sense, Europeans moving within integrated Europe, which means that there's even more language about migrants as absolutely being people who are not Christian or of a Christian origin, so-called, and not white. And I think that all of this creates that kind of palpable sense that integration is necessary, but also maybe unattainable.
We've spoken a lot about the ways in which the push for integration can be racist, can be xenophobic. And I think what's also interesting to look at is that this is something that is pervasive, because I feel as though, and maybe I'm totally off base on this, and I hope that you'll correct me if I am, there is definitely a racist element to this. And I also see integration being sought by French culture in other ways. For example, in the fact that there's not necessarily quite so much of a value placed on individuality, for example. Like there is sort of this model French person, and deviation is not necessarily celebrated in the way that it can be in certain contexts in, for example, the United States, where we're both from. Is that something that you've noticed in your work or in your research or just in your own personal experience?
Yeah, I think that that's such an interesting idea. I've never thought about that, but I think that's such a good point. If I think back to when I studied abroad in Paris, so my first time really living there, I was attending a very bourgeois school in central Paris. I was living with a wonderful family in a very bourgeois neighborhood. And my understanding of Paris and thus of France was that there was this like gray jumper sweater that every single young woman owned, and you could buy it anywhere at any price point, and you had to have it, you know, and there were these particular ballet flats. And again, you could get it at different price points, but you wore it. And these were like the things that everybody was wearing. And so I did sort of take away the idea. And I thought it was very beautiful and elegant that France had sort of collectively decided, like, this is the jumper, or like houndstooth is the pattern. And I thought it was really neat. And then I visited a friend in London and was like, wow, like people are wearing different colors. Like, this is wild. And I kind of remembered, like, right, I like dressing kind of odd and standing out, but not, I don't like to stand out. I want to be one of many people looking odd and having a crazy outfit on. And so I do think that maybe if I'm reading the push for integration in a less insidious or overtly racist way, or maybe covertly racist, which is scarier way, it is part of a broader French assumption that fitting in is good, you know, that looking a certain way as in clothing comportment is good. And in that sense, it does extend beyond excluding people of color, people who are not of a sort of laïc yet Catholic background. But it's clear that then that becomes things like, oh, you don't drink wine, or, you know, we think really insidious things like, oh, you're a school child and you can't eat pork, the only main dish being served today in your cafeteria, you know. But I mean, I got that too. And I think, you know, I really don't eat pork. I mean, at this point, I don't eat meat much. And I think France has become cooler towards vegetarians. But I don't think they really want to hear that you don't eat pork. I think they'd rather hear that you're a vegan, even though that is also not a delight to French people. Yeah, it's such an interesting thing to think about. It's such a good question.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. You know, this push for integration can be overtly racist, can be covertly racist, and can just be omnipresent in ways that don't necessarily always touch up against identity. And yet that is the way that, if at least in an official setting, you know, when a prefecture worker is asking you, have you integrated? They're asking you, have you Frenchified your name? Have you decided to not, you know, wear outward signs of religion? Have you learned French? It's very much that. But I think it's interesting too to think about the ways in which this desire for sameness and not just equality is kind of pervasive through French culture at large.
Mm-hmm, definitely.
And we're both American, so I think it is interesting, and you know, child of the 90s here. So, I mean, I remember in school these pushes to appreciate diversity. Obviously, the political climate is a little bit different right now than it was when we were growing up. But I do remember there being at least a claim of appreciation of diverse cultures and sort of an awareness of, oh, let's talk about, you know, what they eat in different countries and how they celebrate in different countries and what they wear in different countries. And I do think that individuals in the United States often are quite proud of where their ancestors come from. And I remember laying claim to my Italian American heritage when I moved to France, and the French were not only disinterested, they were kind of baffled as to why I would even want to talk about it. And so I'm curious if you think that this push for integration necessarily indicates that the French either don't appreciate or uninterested in cultural, religious, linguistic diversity.
Yeah. In recent years, I've been kind of reckoning, particularly in the ways that I compare the US and France, that I have often, you know, I'll say things like, well, in America, people probably wouldn't think this, but they also would know to not say it out loud, right? And I think in some ways that's still true, but realistically, you know, if I reflect on, I mean, just in the past handful of years, you know, police violence against Black people and people of color, the incredible backlash against Black Lives Matter. This week, the Tree of Life Synagogue Massacre trial is starting. And then the fact that there had to be a Stop API hate campaign shows that there is a lot of hate. So I think that anything I can say about French integration and a French lack of appreciation for diversity has to be nuanced with saying that whatever kind of rhetoric, yes, I absolutely was steeped in my youth. And I hope that it's true that I genuinely believe. It's clear that American society, through all of these celebrations, has in no way succeeded in supporting diverse populations and making communities feel safe or protected, let alone actually protecting them.
If you're enjoying this episode of Navigating the French, you may also be interested in our sister podcast, Paris: A State of Mind, where real estate experts Gail and Marie give you all the tips and tricks you need about renting and buying apartments in Paris and beyond. Navigating the French will be right back after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French.
But yeah, I mean, in terms of France, I sometimes think that the French, and here I'm moving maybe a general overstatement about French society, which of course, what is French society? But I think that the French appreciation of diversity comes from spaces where it appears to be exotic and fun and not threatening. I think there's a lot of beautiful bars and restaurants in France that have a real kind of colonial kitsch, but that doesn't mean that there would be an actual embrace of people whose heritage is kind of being Disneyfied on the walls of those restaurants or something like that. I know, and again, this is just me sort of talking about things that I've read or listened to, but I am a white American person, but certainly there's a lot of pages written on the very warm welcome that Black GIs received in France, particularly after World War I, where they're credited with sort of helping jazz become such an important part of French culture, but also after World War II. And, this is in comparison to the horrific conditions of Jim Crow America, or Josephine Baker finding this really warm welcome in France that she really wouldn't have had in the US. But I think that those stories have to be tempered with the concurrent treatment of Black Africans, both in the metropole and then in the colonies, where at this point, versions of conscripted or compulsory labor, though not technically slavery, were still in place in portions of the French Empire. So I think that, diversity or not integrated cultural practices are sort of a fun diversion, but they need to be understood as separate. Maybe again, back to that idea of, the expat, rather than the idea that they're going to come and change France, which is not welcome, I would say.
That's really interesting. And I would agree that, the discourse that we grew up with is so different from the discourse that we hear now. And it's interesting to see the way that evolved. I'm curious to see the way that the discourse evolves now in France, with people becoming a little bit more outspoken about the sort of insidious ways that a demand for integration has, not just now, but throughout history, asking people to integrate, from a religious perspective, from a racial perspective throughout time. So it'll be interesting to see how this evolves.
Yes.
And one can only hope it evolves in a way that is more person-centric, but I'm not here to prescribe. I'm just here to observe. Well, thank you so very much for joining me today on the podcast. It's been a real pleasure having you on. Can you let our listeners know a little bit about where they can find you, where they can read more from you or hear more from you if they're interested in learning more about your research?
Sure. So, my book is available from any fine bookseller, probably online. Probably not for sale at your local bookshop. I wouldn't call it a beach read, but I hope that folks enjoy it. I occasionally tweet at Megan Hist, MEGANHIST. And then sometimes I attempt to write for a public audience, but that's a little few and far between. I'm around and I'm always happy to chat. I love talking about European integration. Obviously, I think these ideas are really exciting. So I'm always happy to talk and connect more.
Amazing. Great. Well, then before I let you go, I only have one final question for you, which is, what is your favorite word in French?
So maybe this shows that I am integrated, but I really love the word apéro. Mm-hmm. I just think, so apéro, I kind of translate it as happy hour, but it's not appropriate because it's not even about the deal. It's just like the idea that you could just suggest this particular time when, of course, you're going to grab a drink and have a snack and it's not dinner. Yeah, it's just a time of day that I really, really enjoy. The company, the little, realistically kind of disgusting bar snacks that you can, are being reused.
Mm-hmm.
I just really, really love it.
It is a wonderful time of day, and the bar snacks are very odd. But I hope that when apéro time rolls around for you, at the time of us recording, it's nearly apéro time where I am. I think you have a couple more hours to wait. Mm-hmm. But I hope you have a very good apéro whenever apéro reaches you.
Thank you. To you as well.
Thank you. Have a really great rest of your day.
This has been Navigating the French. You can find more from me, Emily Monaco, at Emily_in_France on Twitter and Instagram. This podcast is produced by Paris Underground Radio. To listen to other episodes of this podcast, or to discover more podcasts like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com. Thanks for listening, and à bientôt.
This episode of Navigating the French was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more great content, join us on Patreon at patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio.